They called her the Three-Moon Refused, and they said it the way you say a thing you believe will never change. 3 times Sorenveld had stood before the assembled pack of Thornwall and named her unworthy. 3 successive hollow moons had witnessed the rite. 3 times the binding cup had been raised, and 3 times the pack lord had turned his back on a woman who stood alone in the center of the circle, and did not flinch once. Pack law was clear on this. The third refusal was a door sealed from both sides. No mate claim could undo it. No appeal could reverse it. The third rejection was an ending, and the wilds were waiting beyond the eastern gate, cold and patient as old stone. What no one in that assembly saw, because no one thought to look, was the shape that detached itself from the tree line as she walked out to meet the dark. 4-footed, immense, a wolf of such size that the nearest pines seemed, briefly, to lean away from it. She did not know he was there. She would, before the 3 days were out. If you have found this story and it is speaking something you already know, stay with it. The assembly was wrong about her. You will see exactly how wrong. In the 312th year of the Ashvale Compact, on the night the third hollow moon rose cold and bone-white above the Thornwall Keep, Cale stood in the center of the rejection circle and let Soren finish. She was 22 years old. Her boots were worn through at the left heel, and she could feel the frost-hardened mud through the thin inner sole every time she shifted her weight. She did not shift her weight. She had learned, across 2 prior hollow moons and the long months between them, that stillness read as dignity in a crowd that was actively searching for a reason to pity her. She gave them no reason. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her chin level, and she listened to Soren pronounce her name as though it were a defect of the language, something the tongue was embarrassed to carry. "Cale of no house," he said, loud enough to reach the back ranks of the assembly, "bearing no wolf of standing, of no blood this pack can trace. I refuse the bond for the third and final time. Let the wilds take what Thornwall cannot use." The binding cup hit the stone flags. He had not bothered to set it down. She heard the liquid spread across the flagstones in the cold, and she thought, with the flat clarity that comes when all other thought has been pressed out of a person. He poured it out before he raised it. He never intended to drink. He never had. She did not say this aloud. She turned and she walked toward the eastern gate, and the assembly parted for her the way water parts for something it does not want to touch. Marit was waiting at the edge of the crowd, a small woman with a kennel keeper's calloused hands and a look on her lined face that belonged to someone who had seen cruelty dressed as ceremony too many times to pretend otherwise. She pressed a bundle into Cale's arms as she passed, wool and dried meat and a clay flask of water, and she held on to Cale's wrist for one moment. "East road to the gorge, then south along the shelf," Marit said, low and quick. "There is a hollow in the black pine stand where the wind comes from below, not above. It will be warmer there than anywhere else you will find tonight." Cale looked at her. Maret's grip was tight, tighter than the moment seemed to require, and her eyes were moving between Cale's face and something over her shoulder that Cale could not identify in the crowd. "Go," Marit said, "and do not stop for anything you hear behind you." Kyle went. The gate was old iron, pitted with cold, and it did not open so much as groan aside as she pushed through it. She did not look back. She knew what she would see. Soren already turned away, his advisors pressing close, the assembly rearranging itself around the space where she had been standing, filling it in the way snow fills a print, until there was no evidence a person had ever stood there. She walked east. The wilds of the Ashvale borderlands in the dead of the year were not theatrical about their danger. They did not howl or crack with obvious menace. They simply absorbed warmth, steadily and without pause, the way a deep stone floor absorbs candlelight. The cold was not sharp. It was patient. It waited in the gaps between her coat and her collar, between her fingers and the wool wrap, and it worked slowly inward with the quiet industry of something that had never needed to hurry. She counted her steps to keep her mind from turning in circles. She reached 200 before she heard it. The soft, compressed sound of weight settling into frozen ground, approximately 30 feet to her left and a few paces behind. Not wind, not a branch. Deliberate. She did not stop walking. She had known, somewhere below conscious thought, that the wilds would not be empty. Pack wolves ran these borders, half wild and territorial, and an omega walking alone into their range without a mate claim for protection was a resource the hierarchy did not guard. She had known this when she walked through the gate. She had chosen to walk anyway, because the alternative was standing in Thornwall with a third refusal on her name and a toxin she had not yet identified, beginning its slow work on the part of her that had always been wolf. She did not know about the toxin yet. She would know by morning. The presence kept pace with her. It did not close the gap, did not rush her, did not circle. It simply walked when she walked, 30 feet off and a little behind, matching her stride with a regularity that was almost deliberate. A hunting wolf circled. This one walked alongside. She reached the gorge at the edge of the pine shelf as the moon tilted toward its apex and the cold sharpened enough that each breath left a brief fog before her face. She found the hollow Merritt had described, tucked into the lee of a rock formation where the thermal current from the gorge below pushed warm air upward through a crack in the stone shelf. It was warmer. Not warm, but warmer, the difference between surviving a night and not surviving one. She sat. She pulled the wool tight around her shoulders. She ate a small portion of the dried meat because she understood mechanically that she needed to, though she was not hungry. The presence settled somewhere in the dark at the tree line. She could not see it, but she could feel the weight of it, the particular quality of silence that surrounds a large creature choosing not to move. She said to the dark, "I know you are there." Nothing answered. She wrapped her hands around the clay flask and stared into the black gap of the gorge below and thought about her mother, who had kept a healer's kit in a locked cedar box and had died in a sham trial before Cale turned 15. And about Fen, who was 12 years old and the smallest omega in Thornwall's lower ward, and who had 3 days ago pressed a dried sprig of gold thread root into her hand with the solemn expression of a child carrying out an instruction he does not fully understand. Gold thread. She had not asked him why. She understood why now. Gold thread was the primary binding agent for silver toxin recovery. Her mother had told her that when she was 8 years old, crouched beside the cedar box while her mother's hands moved through the contents naming each component. Gold thread for the silver, black willow bark for the fever. The combination drew silver dust from the blood before it reached the deep wolf tissue, but only if administered within 3 days of exposure. She had looked at the binding cup when it hit the flagstones. She had seen the way the liquid spread. Too thick, too slow, with a faint metallic sheen that water did not carry. She had not let herself understand it in the moment because understanding it in the moment would have shown on her face, and she had not wanted Soren to see what he had done register in her eyes. He had poured silver dust into the binding cup before the rite. Not enough to kill her outright, enough to begin the slow dismantling of her wolf, conducted over days, invisible until the tissue damage passed the point of repair. 3 days from the rite. That was the window. She pressed her palms flat against the cold rock and steadied her breathing and thought. Gold thread grows along the eastern shelf of the gorge, below the ice line, sheltered from the worst of the frost by the thermal current. Her mother had said so. She had a name for where it was. She had, apparently, a 12-year-old ward who had known enough to arm her with the information 3 days early, which meant someone had told him to. The large presence at the tree line shifted. She heard it move closer, not rushing, just closing the distance between 30 feet and 15, and then it stopped again. She should have been afraid. She found that she was not, which she recognized as either courage or the beginning of the toxin's work on her perception, and decided it did not matter which. "Come in from the cold if you mean to stay," she said. "I have dried meat and very little patience for theater." What emerged from the dark was larger than any pack wolf she had ever seen. Black as the space between stars, heavy-shouldered, with a gait that was too deliberate to be predatory. It stopped at the edge of the hollow's thermal reach and stood there, looking at her with eyes that caught the moonlight and returned it as pale amber. She looked back. After a moment, she said, "You are hurt." She had not meant to say it aloud, but she could see it now. A long scoring wound along the wolf's left flank, dark and matted, the kind of cut that comes from moving through something sharp at speed. The creature had been running recently, and whatever it had run through had left a mark. She reached for the cloth strip at the bottom of Marette's bundle, the one she had assumed was spare binding, and she held it out. Not toward the wolf, just held it out, so it could be seen. The wolf came forward. It lay down at the edge of the hollow and turned its flank toward her, and Kale, who had been raised in proximity to her mother's healing work and had learned early that the body's needs did not wait on fear or protocol, pressed her palm flat against the wound to gauge its depth. The bond hit her like the first breath after cold water closes over the head. It was not pain and it was not pleasure. It was recognition. A word her body knew in its marrow before her mind could attach any meaning to it. Her hands lit from inside, a warmth that moved from her palms upward through her wrists and into her chest, and for one disorienting moment the hollow, the gorge, the cold, the entire weight of the night's events, all of it receded and there was only this: contact, and what the contact confirmed. She pulled her hands back. She sat for a long time with her palms in her lap and her pulse moving too fast in her throat, staring at the stone floor of the hollow. The wolf had gone very still. "Cold fever," she said finally, to no one, to herself, to the wolf, to the absurdity of the night. "Nothing. It is nothing." She wrapped the wound carefully, her hands steady by an act of will, and she did not touch the wolf's skin again with her bare palms. She used the cloth as a barrier between her hands and the injury, and she worked quickly and cleanly, the way her mother had taught her, and she did not look at the wolf's eyes. When she finished, she lay down in the hollow with her back to the curved stone wall, and the wolf between her and the open dark, which had not been her intention, but was apparently the wolf's, because it had arranged itself there without being asked, its body heat reaching her through the cold air like a hearthstone, warming a stone floor from below. She slept. If you are watching this story and feeling something you cannot quite name yet, you may want to leave a comment and tell me what you think she deserved. I read them. The answer the assembly gave and the answer the story gives are not the same thing. She woke to Maret. The old woman was crouched at the hollow's entrance in the gray pre-dawn, her breath fogging, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has confirmed a suspicion they were not certain they wanted confirmed. The wolf was gone. Kale was alone in the hollow with Marette's bundle and the cooling depression in the frost where the large body had lain. "He followed you," Kale said. "He did," Marette said. "Who is he?" Maret looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that is deciding something. "Draven Ashvale," she said. "The king." The name landed in Kale's chest like a stone into deep water. The initial impact, and then the long, slow ripple of what it meant. The crowned wolf, the alpha king of the entire compact, whose authority sat above every pack lord in the 14 territories, whose name was invoked in the founding charter that granted Sorenveld his seat. She thought about the bond warmth in her palms. She thought about the wolf lying between her and the open dark. "He knows what I am," she said. Not a question. He knows what you are, Maret agreed. He is known since the first hollow moon, when he came to Thornwall to observe the rite. He has come to everyone. Kale sat with that for a moment, and then she said carefully, I am not going to use this. Maret's eyebrows moved. Use it. Use the bond. Use the fact of what he is to buy my way back into Thornwall, or out of the exile, or into any situation I have not arrived at on my own account. I will not trade on a mate bond I have not been offered and he has not confirmed. Not to a man who ranks every person who dismissed me, and who could end this with a word. I will not. She paused. I have 3 days before the silver dust takes my wolf permanently. I need the gold thread from the gourd shelf. That is what I am doing today. Everything else waits. Maret stared at her for long enough that the silence became a kind of weather. Then she said, very quietly, Your mother would have said exactly the same thing, in almost exactly those words. She pulled from her coat a wrapped cloth packet. Inside it were 2 things, a vial of black willow bark powder and a hand-drawn map, very small, showing the gourd shelf and the location of a gold thread colony marked with a small X in what appeared to be charcoal. He drew that, Maret said. This morning, before he left. Kale took the map. She looked at it for a while. She folded it into her coat pocket and picked up her pack and went toward the gorge. The gorge shelf was accessible by a narrow path that wound down through the black pine stand and then leveled onto a frozen ledge 10 feet wide, hanging over the drop. The thermal current Kale had felt from above was stronger here, rising from somewhere deep in the gorge's floor. Warm enough to keep the rock face weeping thin moisture in a narrow band where the frost could not fully set. In that band, low to the stone, gold thread grew in close mats of deep yellow filament, exactly where her mother had said it would be, and exactly where the map confirmed. She got to the shelf without difficulty. She found the gold thread colony. She was crouched at its edge with her knife out to harvest the roots when the ice cracked. Not the shelf ice. The overhang above the shelf, a fin of accumulated frost that had been holding its shape all winter against the thermal erosion from below, and which chose this particular morning to release. The crack was a single sharp report, and then the overhang came down. Not all of it, enough of it, and Kale was under the frozen shelf before she registered that she was moving. A slab of ice the length of her body came down across the shelf's outer edge, and the thermal gap closed, and she was in a pocket of dark and cold, with the gorge below her on one side, and 6 inches of packed ice above her, and no immediate way out. She was not injured. She took inventory of this fact calmly, and then she took inventory of the space she was in, and the tools she had, and the time she had before the cold of the confined space and the shock of the fall would begin reducing her ability to think clearly. She had her knife. She had the gold thread roots she had managed to harvest before the fall, clutched in her right hand. She had the map and the vial of bark powder, neither of which were useful at this specific moment. She began working the knife along the seam between the fallen slab and the shelf floor, looking for a gap. The ice above her moved. Not a crack this time. A deliberate, sustained pressure from above, applied at the slab's edge with something that had both weight and grip, working the same seam she was working from her side. She felt the slab shift a fraction. She pressed her back against the rock face and pushed with her boots, and the slab moved another fraction and light came through. She crawled out into the cold air and the gray light of morning, gold thread roots in her fist, to find Draven Ashvale in his own shape crouched at the slab's edge, hands braced, knuckles bleeding from the ice. She had not had a clear picture of him before this moment. She had seen him at the hollow moon rites, always at the assembly's edge, always at a distance, a man of height and presence, and deliberate stillness who the crowd subtly reorganized itself around, without appearing to notice it was doing so. Up close, At 6 feet of distance in the flat morning light of the gorge shelf, he was a man whose face had been rearranged by weather and decisions, and by carrying something heavy for a long time. He was not looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he has solved. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they thought they were going to lose. He looked away first. "You knew the shelf was unstable," he said. "It came out rougher than it was probably meant to." "I did not," she said. "If I had known, I would have brought rope." He looked back at her. Something in the set of his jaw shifted very slightly towards something that was not quite anger and not quite relief. "Marette told you who I am," he said. "She did. And you came here anyway, alone." "I needed the gold thread before 3 days passed," she said. "The bond is a separate matter from my wolf's survival. I was not going to sacrifice one to wait on the other." He was quiet for a moment. The gorge wind moved between them, carrying the cold smell of deep water and stone. "Your mother's trade," he said. Not quite a question. "Marit told you." "Marit tells me the things I need to know," he said, "and does not tell me the things she judges I should find out for myself." Kale looked at her hands. The gold thread roots were intact. A good harvest. Enough for the preparation she needed. The knuckles of her left hand were scraped from the ice and oozing slightly, which she registered without concern. She closed her fingers around the roots and looked back up at him. "You came to all 3 rights," she said. A pause. "Yes." "And you said nothing." The muscle at the side of his jaw tightened. "Pack law governs mate rights. The king does not intervene in pack law without formal cause. A pack lord may run 3 moon rejection proceedings without royal challenge so long as the right is conducted with clean materials and proper witness." He stopped. The cup was not clean. She understood then the shape of what had happened, not just the fact of the silver dust, but the strategy behind it. Soren had poisoned the binding cup knowing that if the wolf severance completed, there would be no living evidence that a mate bond had existed. No bond, no grounds for royal challenge, no royal challenge, no examination of the right. The exile would stand, the wolf would die, and the Alpha King would have no legal mechanism to pursue the truth of what had been done, except that Fen had seen. "The boy who gave me the gold thread sprig," she said. "Fen. He came to the border keep this morning. He watched Soren pour the dust 3 nights ago, and he has been trying to find someone safe to tell since the rite ended." Draven's voice was even, but she heard something beneath it. Something held very tightly. "He is 12 years old, and he crossed the lower ward at night to reach a keep he had never been inside because he was afraid you were going to die." Kale pressed her lips together and looked at the gorge. "He is safe?" "He is with Marit. He will remain there." She nodded once. "Soren has called the Blood Tithe Assembly for tonight," Draven said. "He wants the exile formalized before the king can return to the keep and review the right's records. He believes I am 2 days' ride north of here." A pause. "He has been receiving that information from Elder Bryn, who has been sending me falsified routing reports for the better part of 4 months." Kale looked at him. She thought about Elder Bryn, who had sat at the left hand of the assembly dais through all 3 rites, with the expression of a man observing a procedure that was going exactly as intended. "The assembly convenes tonight," she said, "at the 2nd bell." She stood. Her legs were steadier than she expected them to be, which she attributed partly to determination and partly to the fact that the gold thread roots in her hand were going to allow her to prepare the antidote before the bell rang, which meant she would walk into the assembly as a whole person and not a woman, quietly losing the most fundamental part of herself. "Then I have time to prepare the compound," she said, "and you have time to get to the keep before the assembly opens." He stood as well. He was considerably taller than she had estimated from a distance, which she noted with the same flat practicality with which she had noted the ice, the cold, and the wound on his flank the night before. "Kale," he said. She paused. He did not look like a man who said things he had not prepared. He looked exactly like a man working to say something he had not prepared. Last night. When you tended the wound. She waited. I felt it also, he said. I have felt it since the first hollow moon. I want you to know that what I do tonight at the assembly is not the bond pressing me into action. The bond is real, and I am not pretending otherwise. The action would be the same without it. Soren poisoned a member of this pack under a rite I am responsible for overseeing, and he did it with a hidden-hand advisor corrupting my routing information, so I could not arrive in time to challenge it. That is treason against the compact. I would dissolve that assembly and end that man's authority tonight if he had done it to anyone. He paused. But it was you, he said. And that is also true. She looked at him for a long time in the gray gorge light, the roots in her fist, her scraped knuckles stinging in the cold air. I know, she said. I know the difference. She turned and walked back toward the path up to the pine shelf, and after a moment she heard him fall into step a few paces behind her, and this time she did not count the distance between them. The antidote preparation took just under 2 hours in Marette's fire-warmed workroom at the border keep, Kale's hands moving through the steps with the careful muscle memory of someone who had watched the process performed a dozen times as a child and had not forgotten a single element of it. Maret stood at the work table's edge and did not offer guidance because none was needed, and Fen sat on the stool in the corner with his knees drawn up and his eyes following Kale's hands with an expression that was halfway between relief and the particular exhaustion of a child who has been afraid for too long. She administered the compound. The bark and gold thread preparation tasted of iron and deep earth, and she held the bitterness in her mouth for a moment before swallowing because her mother had told her that pausing allowed the binding agents to coat the throat tissue before reaching the blood, which improved absorption. Whether that was accurate medicine or a mother's small ritual, she had never known. She did it anyway. Maret watched her. He has never come to a mate right before, Maret said after a while. In 12 years of kingship, not once. He began coming to Thornwall's hollow moon rites 14 months ago. You are telling me this for a reason, Kale said. 14 months ago was when Soren first registered your name in the mate right rolls, Maret said. Someone in the Ashvale Keep's archive notified Dravon when the registration was filed. He does not know who. He received a sealed note with your name and your mother's name and the words, "This one cannot afford to lose." Maret paused. I sent it. Kale looked at her. Maret's expression was not apologetic. It was the expression of someone who has placed a careful bet and is watching the outcome arrive. Your mother was the finest healer's aide this region has produced in 30 years. She was tried on false evidence because Soren's father wanted her practice's land allocation and did not want to pay for it cleanly. Her daughter inherited her gift and her mother's erased standing and was placed in mate right roles by a pack lord who wanted a third refusal on record so he could claim the erased bloodline's land allocation legally. I sent the note because someone needed to know. Kale turned the empty preparation vessel in her hands. The evening light was coming sideways through the workroom's high window, warm and flat. She thought about 3 hollow moons. She thought about standing in the center of the circle each time with her hands loose at her sides, not flinching. She thought about the amber eyes in the dark at the tree line, matching her pace, not circling, not closing, simply present. What time is it? She said. 1 bell until the 2nd bell, Maret said. Then we should go. Fen uncurled from the stool. He was thin and serious-faced with the watchful eyes of a child who had learned early that attention to small details was a form of protection. He picked up his coat from the floor beside the stool and put it on without being asked. I am coming, he said. Maret looked at him. You are the witness, she said. Yes. You are coming. The Thornwall Hall was firelit and packed when they arrived. The assembly gathered in full under the great iron candelabra that held 40 candles and was lit only for blood tithe proceedings, its light falling in amber columns across the stone floor and the ranked rows of the pack. Soren stood at the dais, flanked by two of his senior advisors, in formal pack lord regalia, a man who had arranged everything to his liking and was waiting for the final procedural step that would seal it. Elder Bryn sat at the dais's left, exactly as he had at every rite. His expression was the same as it had always been, calibrated patience. The hall's noise dropped by half when Kale walked through the main doors. Then it dropped the rest of the way, as the assembly registered what was behind her. Draven Ashvale walked into the Thornwall Hall as if the hall had been built for him to walk into, which in a sense it had, the Ashvale Compact's founding charter having specified that all blood tithe halls in the 14 territories were to be constructed to royal specification and maintained at royal standard. He wore no formal regalia. He wore the clothes of a man who had ridden hard and handled ice, and still looked as though every person in the room had just become aware of their own posture. Soren's face moved through several expressions in rapid sequence before settling on a performance of composure. "My king," he said, "we were not advised of your arrival." "No," Draven said, "you were not." He walked to the center of the hall floor and stopped there, not on the dais, not at the edge of the assembly, but in the center of the open space where the rejection circle was drawn in chalked stone, and the hall was very quiet now. "Elder Bryn," he said, without looking toward the dais's left, "you will remain seated until I address you." Bryn had begun to rise. He stopped. Draven produced from inside his coat a sealed glass vial. He held it up in the candlelight, and the assembly could see the faint metallic quality of its contents. The binding cup's residue, collected from the flagstones before the hall had been cleaned, poured into glass and sealed. "Silver dust," he said, "found in the binding cup used in the third hollow moon rite of Thornwall's 312th compact year. The rite administered to one Kale of the Thornwall pack." He set the vial on the stone floor in the center of the rejection circle. A binding cup laced with silver dust is not a clean rite. It is an assassination conducted under ritual cover. Under Article 12 of the Ashvale Compact's founding law, any pack lord who conducts a covert attack on a pack member under the authority of a rite presided over by the King's Compact surrenders his seat, his claim, and his protection under pack law. He paused. "I am dissolving Sorenveld's blood tithe proceeding. The exile is void." The hall held its breath. Soren's composure broke. Not all at once. In pieces the way ice breaks, a crack across the surface, and then the structure beneath it giving way. "You cannot dissolve a completed rite," he said. "The third refusal was witnessed. The law is clear." "The law is clear," Draven agreed. "You committed treason. The law is also clear on that." "There is no proof the dust was placed by my hand. The cup passed through 4 servants before the rite." Fen stepped forward. He was 12 years old, and he was the smallest person in the hall, and he stood in the center of the firelit room with his hands at his sides, not flinching. "I saw you," he said. His voice was steady. "3 nights ago, in the preparation room off the east corridor, you poured it from a cloth packet into the cup, and you folded the packet into your coat. I was in the room because I was not supposed to be, and you did not see me." He paused. "I saw you." The hall was so quiet that the 40 candles in the iron candelabra sounded, collectively, like a small fire. Soren looked at the boy for a long moment, and then he looked at Dravan, and in his eyes there was the specific expression of a man who has built his entire structure on the assumption that a certain category of person would never be believed, and who has just understood, too late, that this assumption was the fault in his foundation. Draven looked at Elder Bryn. "Falsified routing reports," he said. "For 4 months. I have the originals and I have your seal on the alterations. You managed the information flow to ensure I could not arrive in time to challenge any of the three rights. He let that sit for a moment. You will be stripped of rank and exiled from the Compact's territories before sunrise. If you are found within the borders after sunrise, the law governing active treason against the Compact applies. Bryn said nothing. He had the look of a man who has run the calculation and found it does not balance. What happened next took less time than the assembly would later describe it as taking, because memory compounds significance, and the significant things had, in fact, already been settled. Soren reached for the short blade at his hip, and the two senior advisors beside him stepped back and away, and Draven crossed the floor between them in the time it took the candlelight to swing once in the draft from the door. The blade never cleared the scabbard. When it was over, Sorenveld was on the stone floor of his own hall in the center of the rejection circle, and the hall was very still, and Draven stood in the center of it and looked at the assembly with an expression that was not triumph and was not satisfaction, but was the expression of a man who has paid a cost and accepted that it was the right cost to pay. He turned and looked at Kyle. She was standing at the edge of the open floor with Marette at her left and Fen at her right, and she was looking back at him with the steady, level gaze she had been giving the center of the rejection circle for 3 successive hollow moons, except that this time she was not alone in the center of anything. He walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away, and then he did what the most powerful man in the 14 territories of the Asheville Compact had not done in living memory, what the chroniclers of the Compact would later note as the first voluntary kneel recorded in 312 years of royal proceedings. He went down on one knee on the stone floor of the Thornwall Hall, before the assembly that had watched her dismissed 3 times, and looked up at her. "Kale," he said. Not her station, not her title, not her house, of which she had none. Her name. I am asking, not claiming, not commanding. Asking. The hall around them was making a sound she had never heard from it before, which was no sound at all, not a shifted weight, not a caught breath. 400 people holding themselves completely motionless. She looked at him on one knee on the flagstones of the room that had tried to erase her. She thought about her mother's cedar box. She thought about Fen and his sprig of gold thread. She thought about the wolf in the dark, matching her pace, not circling. "Yes," she said. The bond confirmed in a wave of light that moved outward from where they stood, not from their hands, from the space between them, a pulse of warmth that touched every person in the hall and left several of the older pack members pressing their palms to their chests with the expression of people remembering something they had been told could not exist anymore. Draven rose. He looked at the assembly and he said, in the voice that carried to the back of every hall it had ever entered, "Kale of no house is now Kale Ashvile, Luna of the Compact. If anyone in this hall or in any hall I govern has difficulty with that designation, they will bring the difficulty to me directly." No one moved for a long moment. Then one of the elder she-wolves in the second row lowered herself to one knee. Then the woman beside her. Then, in the widening movement of a stone dropped in still water, the assembly knelt, row by row, until the Thornwall Hall held 400 people on their knees before a woman who had walked into the wilds alone 3 days ago to die in them. Marette, who did not kneel for anything, stood at Kale's left side with her arms folded and her expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who sent a letter 14 months ago and has just received the reply they were waiting for. Fen, at Kale's right, did not kneel either. He was not pack-ranked, and the kneel was not required of him, and he was 12, and had been afraid for 3 days, and was now, for the first time in those 3 days, not afraid. He stood next to Kale with his thin shoulders straight and looked at the kneeling assembly with an expression of complete composure that he would, in later years, describe as the moment he understood what it meant to be in the right place. The morning came gray and cold and clean. Kale stood at the gorge's edge in the first light, Dravan beside her, the two of them looking down at the thermal current rising from the deep water below, the same warmth that had kept the gold thread alive through the worst of the winter. She still held the roots she had harvested the morning before. She had kept them in her coat pocket through the antidote preparation, through the assembly, through the night, the way a person keeps a thing that was hard to reach, even after it has served its purpose, because its purpose was not only the getting, but the getting despite. She opened her hand and let them rest in her palm, the thin yellow filament of them, dried now, curling slightly in the cold air. Draven did not say anything. He had learned, she was finding, that silence was not his default evasion. It was his particular form of attention, the way he was present in a room without taking it over, the way the wolf had walked 30 feet behind her through the dark and let her reach the hollow on her own feet. She closed her fingers around the roots. Behind them, at the pine stand's edge, she could hear Moret's voice, and Fenn's voice in the low, comfortable exchange of two people who have reached an understanding about who is in charge, which would be Moret, and who finds this tolerable, which was Fenn, because Moret had given him breakfast and spoken to him like a person with his own thinking rather than a small problem to be managed. A wind came up from the gorge and moved through the pines above them, a sound like something large settling into a position it intended to keep. Kyle looked at her hand. She looked at the gorge. She let the roots go, one by one, into the updraft, and the current took them upward in a slow spiral before carrying them out over the drop, and they were gone. Draven's hand found hers. It was warm,